They say General Valerius draws strength from Mars, but I saw him weep because the silent girl dropped his favorite bronze olive. The small voice of the slave boy, Titus, echoed against the damp brick of the Subura alleyway. The prefect Cassius grabbed the boy's tunic, eyes wide with lethal concern. A general who weeps is a general unfit to command. A general who weeps over her is a treasonous fool. Titus struggled, pointing a grubby finger toward the high window of the Palatine Hill. In that opulent world, the most feared man in Rome was already moving to protect the one secret that could cost him his head, his crippling devotion to the mute seamstress they all called Stulta. The silence of the night was shattered by the approaching tramping of the Praetorian Guard. General Lucius Valerius Germanicus stood rigid in the morning light, the gold leaf of his armor reflecting the fierce, uncompromising sun. He was the spearhead of Rome, the man who had stabilized the Pannonian frontier and executed the entire staff of a governor who dared to negotiate peace instead of demanding surrender. His routine was the definition of imperial efficiency. Before dawn, he was reviewing logistical scrolls thicker than a man's torso, his fingers tracing routes of grain and legionary movements. He did not eat. He consumed fuel. He did not rest. He calculated the next 24 hours of empire. A tribune, Decimus, reported the movement of cohorts along the Via Appia. Valerius cut him off with a crisp gesture. Tribune, the fourth cohort's standard-bearer uses his right hand to grip the eagle. He should use his left, saving his sword arm. Correct it, or I will correct him. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the absolute weight of the Senate and the legions. Decimus paled, retreating immediately. Valerius did not deal in suggestions, only decrees. His image, the perfect Roman, was meticulously maintained, a fortress of granite and iron. Yet, as the last of his staff cleared the private courtyard, Valerius turned his gaze toward the small, untouched marble statue hidden in the shadows of a laurel bush. It was not of a god or an ancestor, but of a girl, roughly carved. It was a crude sculpture, yet he paid a fortune to have it moved with him from province to province. His authority was absolute, but the interior silence of his villa was deafening. He poured a small cup of dark wine, a transgression this early in the day, and held it to the light. The discipline that carved his public persona was merely a cage holding the memory of his daughter, Lyra. Lyra had been taken by the fever 3 years ago, a swift, brutal theft. She was 6, brilliant, and already asking questions about the stars that his military mind could not answer. The guilt was a physical ache beneath his armor. He was the man who kept thousands safe, yet he failed to protect the one life that mattered. He remembered the last time Lyra spoke, her voice thin and reedy, asking him to read a worn scroll about the Argonauts. He had been too busy reviewing cavalry deployment, duty above all. He chose Rome, and Rome took his daughter. Now that memory was a gaping wound. He was driven not by glory, but by the desperate need to drown the internal silence with the noise of war and administration. He needed to be essential to Rome because he had failed to be essential to Lyra. The only light that pierced this calculated darkness was a fleeting, forbidden image, the quiet, focused intensity of the girl who mended his cloaks, the girl Rome mocked. She held a sliver of the innocence he had lost, a purity that was dangerously magnetic. He saw her face reflected in the dark wine, a silent accusation against his flawless, empty life. The small slave boy's words this morning, overheard through the thick walls, had been a sharp, unexpected pain. The olive had belonged to Lyra. Aelia lived in the shadows of the Palatine, specifically in the damp, airless storerooms beneath the sprawling barracks where the general's extensive retinue of servants and slaves were housed. She was the one who sorted the discarded silks, mended the heavy campaign cloaks, and patched the legion's faded standards. Her hands, perpetually stained with indigo and crimson dye, were her only language. She had been born without the gift of voice, a curse in the clamoring city, and society responded to her silence with scorn, dubbing her Stulta, the dumb one. Her life was defined by exhaustion. 10 hours a day bent over needle and thread, the air thick with dust and wool fibers. She didn't complain, she couldn't. Survival was a steady rhythm of work, a quiet meditation on staying invisible. Her limitations were severe. She couldn't call for help. She couldn't defend herself with words against the casual cruelty of the other slaves, and she had no legal standing whatsoever. Fear was her constant companion, the dull hum of anxiety that permeated every waking moment. But Alia protected something fierce, something worth every hour of toil, her elderly, sickly mother, living quietly in a small rented room across the Tiber. Every coin Alia earned, every scrap of food she managed to save from the kitchen scraps, went across the river. Her mother believed Alia worked in a reputable textile shop. Alia maintained the necessary lie to keep the old woman from worrying about the darkness of her true servitude near the general's house. Her physical weariness was often broken by moments of sharp, intense focus. Alia's eyes missed nothing. Her inability to speak forced her to observe the world with devastating clarity. She saw the true nature of men and events, undistorted by rhetorical flourish or political deception. Lately, her senses had been focused intensely on the discarded paper from the general's office, scrolls tossed into the refuse bins after being copied or summarized. Most servants ignored the trash, but Alia, sorting the cloths near the bins, saw something far more dangerous than simple administrative waste. She saw patterns in the scraps, words she pieced together while others slept. She had found, over several weeks, fragments that detailed military supply lines being intentionally rerouted away from the northern garrisons led by men who were openly critical of Valerius's aggressive, expensive campaigns. More worryingly, she found fragmented correspondence suggesting a specific, high-level senator was selling grain reserves to Eastern traders at exorbitant prices. Reserves Valerius was relying on to feed his incoming auxiliary troops. The general's own supply lines were being deliberately sabotaged, hidden under layers of bureaucratic complexity. Alia couldn't name the crime or the conspirators. She didn't understand the Senate's delicate internal power struggles, but she understood famine, and she understood that if the general's legions starved, the consequences would fall on all of Rome. She held these scraps of truth, silent and heavy, in the folds of her worn tunic. She knew something was wrong, terribly, treasonously wrong, but she lacked the voice to sound the alarm against Rome's most formidable general. Where are you watching from today? The crossing happened not in a grand hall, but in the echoing solitude of the general's private armory, a place usually off-limits to everyone, except his most trusted aide, Galerius. Alia had been tasked with repairing a tear in the heavy scarlet drape that covered the main wall map, a tear caused by Valerius's frustrated fist during a late-night council. She worked near dusk, when the light was fading and the shadows stretched long and thin, minimizing her visibility. Valerius entered the armory unexpectedly, having dismissed Galerius moments before. He was not in armor, but wore a simple, dark tunic, his shoulders heavy with a weariness that Rome never saw. Alia immediately froze, pressing her back against the tapestry, her needle suspended mid-stitch. She felt the sudden, crushing weight of his presence, not the harshness of a superior, but the sheer, overwhelming mass of command authority. Valerius did not see her immediately. He walked slowly to a low wooden stand where a single, small bronze olive was placed, the same one the slave boy had mentioned. It was dull with age, not polished, and slightly dented. He picked it up, his massive fingers dwarfing the object. His breath hitched, a silent internal sound that Alia, attuned to silence, registered acutely. He stood there for a long time, the olive resting in his palm. Alia, hidden by the scarlet folds, observed him. This was not the marble man of the Roman Forum. This was a man undone by a memory, stripped bare by private grief. The contrast between the sheer power she knew he wielded and the profound, crippling emptiness she witnessed was jarring. It was as if she saw the foundational crack in the fortress of his soul. Then Valerius moved, placing the olive back down with deliberate care. He turned abruptly, his peripheral vision finally registering the small, motionless figure against the wall. Alia lowered her head instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting the sharp, immediate dismissal, or worse. She felt his gaze, intense and unblinking. It wasn't curiosity or anger. It was an assessment. He looked at her stained fingers, the delicate precision of her stitches, and then at her face, which was marked by fatigue and fear. Valerius opened his mouth, perhaps to demand her departure, but nothing came out. He simply looked. He saw not Stulta, the dumb slave, but the stillness, the quiet dignity in her labor. He saw a flicker of profound sadness in her eyes that mirrored his own. Aelia held her breath, unable to move. She realized in that tense moment that she was not looking at a general, but at a captive of his own creation. He had the power to conquer the known world, but not the power to escape the grief clinging to him. Valerius finally gave a sharp, almost involuntary nod, acknowledging her presence without granting permission to stay, and strode out, his cloak swirling behind him. He left behind a palpable tension. Aelia sank against the wall, trembling. Their lives, two extremes of the Roman structure, had touched. An invisible line had been crossed. She had seen too much of the man beneath the armor, and he had seen the quiet witness she truly was. Something had shifted in the balance of their separate worlds, and Aelia knew, with a chilling certainty, that something huge was about to go terribly, irremediably wrong. The strange detail presented itself during Valerius's public triumph preparation. A delegation from the recently pacified Dalmatian region arrived, bearing gifts meant to symbolize their submission and the bounty of their lands. Among the heavy silverwork and casks of wine, there was a crate of carved wooden soldiers, toys intended for the children of Rome's elites. They were crudely made, clearly provincial work, but brightly painted. Aelia was in the outer courtyard overseeing the cleaning of the general's receiving tent when she saw the crate being unloaded. Everyone else, the legionaries, the scribes, the receiving staff, dismissed the toys as trivial common tribute. But Aelia remembered the scrap of parchment she had salvaged days earlier, a private, coded note referencing a hidden shipment routed through Dalmatia, disguised as children's folly, intended for Senator Crassus, the man whose name had appeared in connection with the sabotaged grain supply. She watched the transfer of the crate. Instead of being delivered to the main stores, it was diverted. The legionary tasked with its handling, a man named Flaccus, was known to be a fiercely loyal retainer of Valerius's chief of staff, a man who had recently begun wearing silk too fine for his rank. Flaccus handled the crate with an anxiety that transcended mere duty. He glanced constantly toward the general's villa, his jaw tight. Aelia's gut twisted. She understood the visual language of fear and conspiracy far better than any Roman orator understood Latin. The toys were a decoy. The sheer nervousness Flaccus exhibited over a box of wooden dolls was incoherent. The true danger was inside the crate, or the crate itself was a signal. The dilemma rooted itself deep within her silence. Should she intervene? To approach anyone in Valerius's inner circle with only gestures and fearful eyes would accomplish nothing but her own immediate torture and execution. They would laugh at Stulta, the fool, claiming she saw treason in children's playthings. She stood frozen, calculating the risk, if she was right. This crate was a thread that led directly into the heart of the conspiracy to starve Valerius's legions, a conspiracy that meant widespread death and chaos. If she remained silent, she was complicit in a colossal betrayal of Rome. But if she spoke, or even pointed, she would expose herself. She protected her mother by remaining invisible. Action meant the end of that safety. The image of Valerius, standing broken over the bronze olive in the armory, flashed in her mind. He was powerful, yes, but he was also the target. If he fell, the ensuing civil struggle would consume all the little people like herself. Flaccus quickly disappeared down a side corridor, the crate clutched tight. Aelia knew she had mere minutes before the evidence vanished into the labyrinthine logistics of the villa. The fear was crushing, icy in her veins. Her mind screamed for action, but her body was bound by years of conditioned servitude and silence. She could only watch the spot where the crate had been. She realized that the greatest risk was not acting and letting the plot proceed. She had the truth, and holding it silent was a betrayal of a different kind, a betrayal of the desperate. Fragile hope she held for Rome. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her decision made, though the means to execute it were still terrifyingly unclear. The corridor Flaccus had entered led to the private archive, a place where General Valerius kept records that even the Senate was not privy to. Aelia knew the layout. She had cleaned the outer doors countless times. She knew the general would be occupied in the war room for the next hour, reviewing battle strategies. Her heart felt like a drum being beaten beneath her ribs. She couldn't scream a warning, she couldn't write a note, and expect a busy tribune to believe the illiterate slave. She needed to leave an undeniable visual proof. Aelia crept down the damp stone passage. The silence of the archive wing was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the ceiling. Flaccus was inside, and she could hear the scraping of wood on stone. He was moving the crate. She reached the door. It was heavy bronze, secured by a standard military bolt lock. She couldn't open it. She flattened herself against the cold stone, listening, her mind racing for an alternative. She remembered the bronze olive, the one he wept over, the one connected to his lost daughter. It was his deepest vulnerability, his private altar. Aelia retreated, moving like smoke back toward the armory. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached the wooden stand. She picked up the bronze olive. It was cold, heavy, and infinitely precious. She knew what she was doing, using the general's deepest wound as a weapon against his own ignorance. Returning to the archive door, she knelt. She didn't have time to retrieve more fragments or try to write a message. She needed to force the general, Valerius, to investigate this corridor immediately, without staff, without warning. Aelia took the bronze olive and, with a quick, deliberate motion, slid it into the slight gap between the door and the frame, wedging it hard against the bolt. The bolt could still be drawn, but the olive would fall, landing with a specific, sharp clink on the stone floor, an unmistakable sound in the pervasive silence. Anyone opening that door would instantly see the object of Valerius's private veneration, lying abandoned on the floor outside a secured area. It was an act of profound, calculated disrespect, a sacrilege in the general's private religion of grief. Only someone deeply familiar with his habits, or someone attempting to frame a rival, would dare touch the object. Aelia stood up, the silence after the action feeling unbearably loud. She did not wait for the inevitable discovery. She ran, not back to her post, but out into the maze of the city, intending to hide until she knew the outcome. The consequence was immediate. She was now a runaway slave, a grave offense. But the story had turned. She had thrown a precious, tiny piece of bronze into the gears of the imperial machinery, forcing the greatest general in Rome to turn his gaze away from the frontier and inward, toward the shadows of his own house. She just hoped he would recognize the signal, before Flaccus finished his treacherous work. General Valerius returned to his private quarters, his mind still heavy with the demands of the Pannonian logistics. He strode toward the armory, intending to collect the scrolls detailing troop readiness, seeking the familiar stoic silence of the room. As he passed the archive corridor, his military senses, always acutely tuned, registered a small anomaly on the stone floor. He stopped dead. Lying in the dust next to the heavy bronze door was the bronze olive, Lyra's olive. The shock was physical. It was not merely misplaced, it was placed. Valerius felt a cold professional rage eclipse his grief. The olive never left the armory pedestal. Its presence here was a deliberate statement, an intimate trespass. Only a handful of people knew the significance of the object, and those were the people he trusted most, his staff. The cold realization hit him. The danger was not external, but internal. Someone was not only inside his security perimeter, but was using his greatest personal vulnerability as a means of communication or malice. Valerius did not summon the guard. He knew any alarm would instantly alert the perpetrator, who was clearly close. He knelt, picking up the small bronze sphere, his jaw locked tight. He examined the door. The bolt was slightly scuffed, as if the object had been wedged there, forcing the user of the door to dislodge it. He drew the bolt and pushed the door open, stepping inside the archive. The room was deep, lined with thousands of clay tablets and scrolls, and there against the back wall was the crate, the Dalmatian tribute of children's folly. It was partially open. Valerius approached it, his hand instinctively resting on the dagger concealed beneath his tunic. The crate did not contain toys. It contained small, tightly bound scrolls of parchment, far too valuable to be mere administrative papers. Hidden beneath a thin layer of sawdust, he found sealed orders. They were not general's orders. They were forged requisitions, stamped with the imperial seal, but meticulously altered. They detailed a massive diversion of grain from the Aquileia reserves to a private merchant fleet bound for Syria under the pretense of emergency foreign aid. Valerius calculated the impact instantly. The loss meant starvation for 2 legions in the north by winter's end, and a destabilization of the very frontier he had secured. It was treason, executed with bureaucratic finesse. But the most damning scroll was a short, crisp note from Senator Crassus, confirming the transaction and referencing Flaccus, the chief of staff's loyalist, as the recipient of the payment. The general's own headquarters had been the logistical hub for the betrayal. Valerius crushed the parchment in his fist. His rage was terrible, silent, and focused. He realized that the person who left the Olive had done so as a desperate, wordless plea, a warning that bypassed the normal channels of command, precisely because those channels were compromised. They hadn't wanted to reveal themselves, only the threat. He stormed out of the archive, sealing the door again. He looked down the corridor, now seeing the shadows not as benign architectural features, but as conduits for treachery. Who was bold enough, observant enough, and silent enough to pull this off? He summoned Galerius, his true aide, his voice dangerously even. "Galerius, where is the mute seamstress?" "Stulta." "General, I believe she was cleaning the outer courtyard this afternoon. Should I retrieve her for questioning?" Valerius stared hard at Galerius. "No, find her. Do not question her. Bring her to me, immediately and quietly. If anyone else touches her, they lose their life." The hunt was on, not for a perpetrator, but for the fragile, silent witness who had risked everything to save his life and his army. Aelia was found hiding in the dye shed, curled among damp bolts of crimson cloth, shivering. Galerius brought her to Valerius's private study not with force, but with a silent respect that surprised her. The study was dark, lit only by a single oil lamp casting long, nervous shadows. Valerius stood before his desk, the bronze olive resting in his hand. He dismissed Galerius, leaving the 2 of them alone in the oppressive quiet. Aelia stood rigidly, prepared for the lash, the prison, the absolute end of her small existence. Valerius stared at her, not with anger, but with a scrutinizing intensity that stripped away her defenses. "The olive," he finally stated, his voice a low rumble. "You placed it at the archive door." Aelia nodded once, a quick, jerky motion. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, not of fear of him, but the overwhelming anxiety of exposure. "Why?" Valerius demanded. "You are a slave. What do you care for the movement of grain or the stability of my command?" Aelia reached into the folds of her tunic, her fingers fumbling with the scraps she had collected over weeks. She laid them on the general's polished mahogany desk. They were small, frayed pieces of papyrus detailing the rerouting schedules, the initial mentions of the Dalmatian shipment, and a confusing ledger entry that listed Crassus's payment under a coded name. Valerius picked them up one by one, his gaze flicking from the fragments to Aelia's face. He pieced the story together rapidly, his military mind connecting the dots that her silent observation had provided. The crude, partial truths mirrored exactly the sophisticated betrayal he had uncovered minutes before. "You read these," he stated, surprised. Aelia shook her head, pointing instead to the letters, the formation of the symbols. She tapped the words grain, Chowin North, and Crassus. She then made a gesture, a bowl empty, followed by a wide sweep of her hand, indicating vast emptiness. She mimed soldiers starving, then pointed to the crate of toys. The confrontation was entirely soundless, yet devastatingly clear. Aelia was not dumb. She was articulate through necessity, communicating a treasonous plot with 3 gestures and scraps of garbage. Valerius gripped the desk edge. He had dismissed her as stulta like the rest of Rome, yet she was the only one in his entire command structure who saw the silent threat and possessed the courage to act. His perfect life, his fortress of duty and discipline, had been an illusion. The powerful men around him were the traitors, and the quiet, marginalized woman was his only loyal sentinel. "Flaccus is gone," Valerius informed her, keeping his voice dangerously low. "He knew I was closing in. Crassus will deny everything, citing forged documents and administrative error. They will use your absence, your flight from the shed, to claim you were the thief, the madwoman who fabricated the evidence. Alia stared at him, terror replacing anxiety. The full weight of her choice settled on her. She had saved the army, but damned herself. Valerius looked down at the bronze olive, then back at Alia. He saw the pure, unyielding fear, but also the deep moral integrity. In her silence, he heard the voice of his lost daughter. The honesty Rome had choked out of him. The lie of his perfect control had fallen. The reality was that his life hung on the invisible thread of a slave's silent courage. The fallout was swift and brutal, a concentrated shockwave through the imperial apparatus. Valerius moved with the efficiency of a seasoned executioner. Within 2 days, Senator Crassus was arrested, not by the Praetorian Guard, but by Valerius's own loyal Pannonian veterans, bypassing the corrupt city authorities entirely. Crassus's vast network of mercantile assets was seized, and the scandal consumed the Senate. The political consequences for Valerius were severe. He had alienated powerful allies, and was now viewed by the imperial court as too dangerous, too independent, and too willing to expose high-level corruption. His absolute authority in Rome began to crumble under the weight of his own righteous actions. Alia, meanwhile, was officially listed as a runaway slave, intensifying the lie for her own safety. Her mother was quietly moved by Galerius, Valerius's aide, to a small protected villa outside Ostia, under the guise of being the housekeeper for a wealthy merchant family. The separation was painful. Alia could not say goodbye. She could only leave a perfectly mended blanket, her final silent reassurance for her mother to find. She lost her only source of familiar comfort, the life she had risked everything to maintain. Valerius paid the price on both a public and personal level. His lifelong friend, the chief of staff, implicated by Flaccus before he lost his life resisting arrest, was tried and swiftly sentenced. Valerius had to sign the decree himself, the betrayal scarring him deeper than any frontier skirmish. The image of the invincible general was tarnished. Rome now saw the man who purged his own house, not the one who conquered territories. He was seen as a threat to the established profitable order. The legions were saved, the grain arrived, but the victory felt hollow. Valerius sat in the solitude of his study, the fragments of the conspiracy spread across his desk. He had achieved justice, but at the cost of his standing in Rome. He knew the Senate would move to marginalize him, sending him to an impossible, distant command, where he would either fail gloriously or be quietly eliminated. He had saved thousands of soldiers he had never met, thanks to the impossible courage of one silent woman. Alia, hidden in a secure, sequestered wing of the villa, was now his prisoner, his secret, and his unintended conscience. She had nothing left but her life, granted to her by the man she saved. Valerius had everything the empire could offer, yet he felt profoundly, irrevocably alone, burdened by the realization that honor and power were mutually exclusive in the rotten core of Rome. The truth was bought, not with gold, but with the painful, necessary sacrifice of status and connection. The fall of Crassus was the rise of a new, complex bond forged between the powerful general and the silent slave. A bond built on shared knowledge and mutual isolation. 3 months later, the dust had settled into an uncomfortable calm. Valerius was assigned the governorship of a desolate province in North Africa, a clear attempt by the Senate to remove him from the center of power. He accepted without protest, seeing it as a reprieve, a chance to rebuild, away from the poisonous politics of Rome. Before departing, Valerius stood in his private study, the same room where Alia had laid bare the conspiracy. She entered not as a slave, but wearing simple, clean clothing, no chains, no marks of servitude. Valerius had not yet spoken of her future, choosing to wait until their departure was imminent. He handed her a scroll. It was not a manumission paper. It was an official decree, meticulously sealed and signed, recognizing her status as a client of the general's house. A position granting her specific protections, a living wage, and the right to travel and work autonomously, without being owned by anyone. It was a status almost unheard of for someone of her origins, a clear statement of her worth, secured under his own name, which would carry weight even in Africa. Alia took the scroll, her hands steady. She looked at Valerius, truly looked at him, recognizing the cost of this gesture. He was risking further censure by elevating the woman who had brought down a senator. Valerius spoke, his voice softened by the miles he had traveled in his mind. In Rome they called you stulta, but you saw the rot that I, with all my power and authority, missed. In Africa, you will manage my household records. No one will question you. Your silence, Aelia, is the only honesty I have left. He did not offer romantic words or grand promises. He offered trust, safety, and purpose, a dignity Rome had denied her. Aelia nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She made a gesture she had never made before. She placed a hand over her heart, and then extended it, a profound, silent oath of loyalty. She finally had a voice, not through sound but through the general's unwavering protection and her essential role in his new life. Valerius looked at her, and for the first time since Lyra's death, the crushing guilt eased slightly. He hadn't saved the world, but he had saved one good person, and in doing so, she had saved his honor. They were two outcasts, the disgraced general and the silent guardian, setting sail for a difficult, uncertain future, bound together by the secret knowledge that the greatest power in Rome was not the legion, but the quiet courage of the marginalized. They walked out to the waiting carriage, leaving the gilded cage of Rome behind them, moving toward the harsh African sun, where a true, quiet form of redemption might finally be possible. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more emotional and epic tales like this one.